I am Professor Yuki Terazawa from the History Department. I usually teach Asian history, Japanese, Chinese, sometimes Korean history. So I'm here to introduce our great, our speaker, Ms. Melkonian, but I would like to give a brief introduction to this talk as somebody who was born and raised in the Nagasaki area. I was not born and raised in the city of Nagasaki, but I was raised and born, I was born and raised in Nagasaki Prefecture. And so the story of my family is that my father's side, my grandmother was a single mother raising 3 children, and then she was running a fish market. But then the April of 1945, the government confiscated the land where she was doing this, her business. So she had to move all the way to the countryside and then get help from her relatives. But this is why, so they were living in the city of Nagasaki until April of 1945. But they moved out from the city in April, and then this is the only reason why they survived, and then they were not they did not become the victims of atomic bomb, and then I was born. So I feel very strongly. So as somebody who did K-12 education in Nagasaki area, I, along with all other children, read numerous stories of atomic bomb survivors as a child. People in Japan, especially those in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, felt very, very strongly about one of the most horrible tragedies that they experienced, that the world experienced, which was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then that led many Japanese people to form this energetic anti-nuclear disarmament movement in Japan. I'm teaching, this semester, I'm teaching a modern Japanese history course. So when I first talked to Ms. Melkonian, I was primarily thinking about that Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led to anti-nuclear disarmament movement. We had never thought that there would be a serious and an immediate nuclear threat that we are witnessing in this regarding this Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it has been shocking to me that we thought that when Cold War ended, we thought that we can now move on to the elimination of nuclear weapons, and then the world didn't move that way, and we are having very serious threat, the threat which is more serious than we experienced during Cuban Missile Crisis. So this talk became timely, and this, to me, this is very sad, but I'm very glad that we have this wonderful speaker, Ms. Melkonian, today. So why don't I just introduce Ms. Melkonian? Melkonian studied fine arts at Hunter College and a graduate of Hofstra University. And then she is currently the director and then co-founder of the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives. She's also, Downstate Chair of Peace Action New York State, PANYS. She coordinated the Peace Fellow Program at Hofstra University, which began in the spring of 2013 and then continued on to 2019. The Long Island Alliance of Peaceful Alternatives is a community partner of Hofstra Center for Civic Engagement. She was a vice president of the Hague Appeal for Peace and then its representative to the United Nations for several years. In 1999, she was the program coordinator for disarmament and human security for the Hague Appeal for Peace conference, which was organized by civil society and engaged over 10,000 participants. So please welcome Ms. Melkonian. Now it's her turn to talk.
Okay. Thank you, Yuki, and the Cultural Center for inviting me to participate in this program today. I've been doing this work for more than 40 years, and one of the things that strikes me from the story and that Yuki just shared with us about her family escaping the bomb in Nagasaki because of moving out of the city before the bomb was dropped. Every year there are commemorations in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki and all over the world, and here on Long Island. For 40 years we've had Long Island commemorations of the dropping of the atomic bombs by the United States. And we include in the program because we can't forget what happened and the beginning of the nuclear age with the dropping of those bombs by the United States. That in Hiroshima, so we read something, and I'm just going to start with that because I want to tell a little bit about, most of you probably are history majors or not, but it's the frame of history shapes our lives. And so I want to give you a little bit of the sense of how the nuclear weapons issue and the threat of nuclear war affected my life and brought me to what I'm doing today. So I'm going to start with that. But I want to begin with what we read when we do the commemorations, that in 1945, those two cities were destroyed by the first and only use of atomic weapons by the United States or anyone in warfare. In Hiroshima on August 6th at 8:15 a.m., an estimated 80,000 people were immediately killed by the dropping of that bomb. By the end of the year, because of injury and radiation, the casualties rose to 90 to 140,000. Approximately 69% of the city's buildings were completely destroyed. In Nagasaki on August 9th, using a plutonium bomb, the death toll totaled 73,884, and another 74,909 people were injured, and another several hundred thousand died due to fallout and for other illness by radiation. The dropping of the bomb changed things forever. That, as Einstein has said, everything changed except the way we think. And the fact that now we are almost 77 years later, still contemplating the possible use of nuclear weapons in another war in the Ukraine and Russia is where we'll probably get to. These bombs are the only weapons of mass destruction that haven't been yet prohibited by international treaties. We have treaties on chemical weapons and on biological weapons, and we are currently working with partners here in this country, with Peace Action, with international campaigns to prevent nuclear war, with ICANN, and groups around the world of working to get the working on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I'm grateful again to Yuki because the role and the story of the survivors and the stories of the families of survivors is really important. In the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic blast, really provide and have provided that background and that urgency to the issue of eliminating nuclear weapons, and I'm grateful for that. And have met many of them. I'll look it up and probably try to put it on the post, but there's poets and other stories of provocation, and it's important for us to kind of remember that because it informs the current moment we're in. You might also want to look at a book by John Hershey called Hiroshima that gives testimony again of people in Hiroshima at the time, and another book called The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell that connects the issues, and he has done a great deal of work in terms of lifting up and connecting the role, and I know Yuki wanted me to focus on that, the role of people and movements in terms of what I call the incremental progress towards nuclear disarmament. My own, having as a baby boomer after World War II, my early years, which the threat of nuclear use was imminent, that we were scared and did duck and cover. I mean, people don't kind of like laugh about that and think that we're not doing that anymore, but that was something that we did when we were in grammar school. But I think the one event that shaped my early years was being a junior in high school during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's mind-boggling now to me that when we went to school, I mean, President Kennedy went on, which wasn't something that happened all that often in those years, went on TV to tell us that there was this confrontation with the Soviet Union had put missiles in Cuba, and we announced a blockade, and we were going to do everything we could in terms of making them take those missiles out. And so I want to come back to that. But I think that Cuban Missile Crisis, what strikes me today is, as a mother and a grandmother, is that we went to school and we went to work. And in my school, the announcements would like, we have to pray for world peace. I think that galvanized, that event galvanized a nuclear movement that has those, goes back into the 60s. And how that war and the use of nuclear weapons was averted, and the lessons from it, I think we need to kind of take a look back at it. A lot of things happened then that we didn't really know at the time. I mean, that it ended, the nuclear war was prevented, and that would have been a total annihilation of the planet, with the nuclear weapons from the United States hitting the weapons in Russia and weapons hitting us here. So the millions of people would have died, and they knew that. The planners knew that, and that was part of the discussions, and we know more about that now. And we didn't have the kind of communications we have now between the United States and Russia, or between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. So some of the lessons were that some things had to be put in place so that we would have a better understanding about how to prevent accidents. But we also know how close we came to those nuclear weapons being launched. And we also know that there was a secret agreement that we didn't know at the time, made between Khrushchev at the time, and President Kennedy, that the Soviet Union would withdraw the weapons from Cuba, and we withdraw similar missiles that were on their doorstep in Turkey. And that diffused the situation. And that set into motion and galvanized people in terms of civil society movements, looking at the legacy and the consequences and costs of nuclear weapons in terms of lives, in terms of treasure, and the need to have treaties in place that reduce the risks of a nuclear war. So that really had a profound influence on me. So I growing up in the nuclear shadow. Here on Long Island, when I moved to Long Island, we were facing the Cold War, and we were on the brink, and an arms race that was out of control, with 50 nuclear weapons in the United States and Soviet Union. And we knew that these weapons could be used. We already knew that through miscalculation. We know more now too, that by accident or miscalculation, these weapons could be used. And we still have that problem as we get closer to the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons in Russia and in Ukraine, because we still have first use. That means if we think we're going to be attacked, we're going to use the nuclear weapons. If we're losing a conventional war, we might use nuclear weapons. And the hair trigger policies, both our countries have that. So it's really important to think about, for me, and the work that I've done with the nuclear freeze. And I want to describe how robust that was with the same committee for a sane nuclear policy at that time in the 80s, and with the nuclear freeze movement that was very much informed and struck me very strongly by the work of Randy Forsberg in the nuclear freeze movement, and with the collaboration of other peace groups. But her work really connected the use of nuclear weapons and the dangers they pose, and it connected it to U.S. foreign policy and Soviet Union policy and other countries' policies that, in terms of military interventions. We live in a world where great powers throughout for centuries have intervened in smaller countries for resources, for land, for many reasons. And we saw throughout the 80s interventions by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and we saw interventions in the 80s by the United States in Central America and in other places. So that nuclear freeze movement and the same groups were a real grassroots organization that trained so many of us and told us it's true today as it was then, that we needed to educate ourselves. We needed to know about nuclear weapons, that they were land-based and submarine-based and sea-based, and bombs from airplanes, and the dangers of all of that. And we needed to know the numbers, and we needed to know how much all of this costs, and what it was costing us. That I would argue that the production and the use of nuclear weapons has changed everything forever in terms of it altered the landscape of air and polluted the air and the land and the water. We still face those consequences today. If you examine the nuclear weapons production sites at Savannah River or at Hanford, and many places here in the United States, and the production of weapons and the uranium mining, you can see how it altered the landscape in terms of the air and the water, and how it impacted on people's health and on communities. We could call those national sacrifice areas in some ways, but it also, when you look at, and I want to get to the role that civil society and these peace movements played in educating people, mobilizing people, having with the nuclear freeze town meetings, and we've had these similar town meetings in recent times about the nuclear weapons ban treaty, to get people to support it. And now that it went into effect in 2021, it is international law, and that's huge. And there's so many things to be paying attention to right now that can. Given the fact that we're living in a time of pandemic and a time of global climate change, and now in a time of war and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons, I think it can seem overwhelming, but I think we need to look to the past in some ways about the mobilization that took place in the 80s and the 90s and in 2000, and how that accomplished some moving back from the brink. The global marches for nuclear disarmament this June marks the 40th anniversary of 1 million people gathering in New York City calling for nuclear disarmament. We make those similar calls today because we know how much nuclear weapons are costing us in terms of lives and treasure, and how much it has affected and the people around the world in terms of the cost. So I think that one of the things that I think we need to look at with like regular folks, just like you and me, um, got ourselves up to speed about these things and became part of organizations. We demonstrated, we met with officials, and we examined the costs, and so that there was progress. Like we were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere until groups like Women's Strike for Peace said this is affecting children, and there's strontium-90 in the teeth. The people that were living downwind from the nuclear sites, testing sites here in this country, or the islanders in the Pacific, they were facing health consequences because of that. So that there were pressure from people on governments, and there were treaties in the UN that prohibited the partial test ban, prohibited atmospheric testing, and the comprehensive test ban treaty prevented underground testing. We had, at the height of the Cold War, and I think pressure from the disarmament groups, those millions of people in New York and around the world that demonstrated for nuclear disarmament, for abolishing nuclear weapons and funding human needs and not weapons of mass destruction. The treaty system, we need to kind of examine that, and the role of the UN in where we go forward in this current crisis that we face. But the treaty system, that with Gorbachev and Reagan meeting and agreeing to limit the numbers, we had 50,000 nuclear weapons back at that time, ready and poised. Those new weapons have been reduced, and the majority of them are held by the United States and Russia, but they were reduced because of the incremental treaties that I put. They'll be in the chat. I think Carol's going to put it in the chat, but there are organizations that you can look up to see what the treaties did and the timelines for them. And the treaties were a learning curve, and that's important to know. The non-proliferation treaty it was a grand bargain that prevented. We had 1 and then 2 and then 5. Now we have 9 nuclear weapon states. But the non-proliferation treaty was a grand bargain that said to the non-nuclear nations that if you agree to not pursue the development of nuclear weapons, that you will, the West would provide, or other countries would provide, support for nuclear power. We might question that grand bargain, as it is called, because of the consequences and the dangers of nuclear waste and the nuclear reactors in themselves. We've had certain wake-up calls in terms of the whole nuclear power issue. But that treaty laid the groundwork, the non-proliferation treaty, for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, because the nuclear nations were also bound in that grand bargain with having to develop plans for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And so that's what the UN Treaty on the Prohibition and Use of Nuclear Weapons builds on. And that's where we are in that kind of effort right now. It became international law. It was signed by 86 countries, ratified by 60. It only needed 50. That was the threshold to become international law. But just like the UN Charter is international law, binding all of the countries of the world, not the Treaty on the Internet to prohibit nuclear weapons is law. It means nuclear weapons cannot be produced and they cannot be used. And that's a process that I would argue, when people ask where's the peace movement that was there in the 80s, I would argue that we never went away, that we built generation after generation, following the examples of all the folks that led the peace and disarmament movements in collaboration with other organizations for the last several decades. The process of even the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has engaged civil society and governments, and as a result of these actions that were done in the past that bring us to this moment. And we're still using that treaty to educate the public and to mobilize other governments to sign on. We expected, and I want to bring us maybe to this moment for a second. We expected with during the Cold War and then the reductions and then the end of the Cold War with the end of the Soviet Union, we expected a peace dividend. We expected a new global security framework, a strengthened United Nations. And instead, we've had billions of dollars spent by the United States during this period at the end of the Cold War, $1 billion spent on modernizing nuclear weapons and delivery systems and the development of tactical nukes that we're seeing that they're talking about, those could be used, and that makes nuclear weapons more likely to be used. The doctrine of deterrence, or MAD as it used to be called, that if we used our weapons and somebody else used their weapon, Soviet Union used their weapon, it would be the end of any meaningful life as we would know it. That system of deterrence, the fact that we can now be considering seriously that these weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, and they're not like just smaller and not going to kill so many people. We know that even limited exchanges of weapons, when we talk about how we went from one country to two countries to, so how many countries are there now? Anybody know? 9 countries have nuclear weapons, including the United States, the UK, France, China, Russia, and India, Pakistan, and Israel, North Korea. So when Pakistan and India acquired nuclear weapons, many of the scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and other experts on this issue, looked at what even limited exchange would be between those two countries. And the ensuing nuclear winter that would occur would have an enormous effect on global climate change, which we have so much awareness about today. I think when we think about the fact that we haven't thought about nuclear weapons for a long time, I mean, most of us, some of us who live and breathe this stuff, or I guess as a young person, I felt very early on that I was responsible for a US foreign policy. So that's the challenge about how much we take on in terms of our work and our commitment to a better world. One of the hopes of the United Nations and the United Nations Charter was to save future generations from the scourge of war. So if we take that seriously, we have to look at this new shift in how we think about nuclear weapons, and think about the fact that this conflict and war in Ukraine and Russia brings once again the specter of nuclear use of weapons into our field of vision. The unthinkable now seems more likely as tensions rise between the United States, the West, and NATO versus Russia. And one of the things I think about, one of your faculty members, Rusty Eisenberg, Professor Eisenberg, talks about, when she talks about the Ukraine issue, we weren't earlier on in the discussions talking so much about the nuclear weapons. That's a more recent add-on, but she was talking about where did you come in on the movie? And that's what I meant when I started this, you know, like all of us come in with a worldview based on our experience or historical events, and even our understanding of what's going on in Ukraine and with NATO and with Russia and the United States and the West, Europe. It depends on, did we just come into it now? We're just learning about it now. How far back do we go? Do we look at 2014? Do we look at all of the years, the skirmishes that have been going on in parts of the Ukraine with the Russians for a long time without the world or paying attention? So I think that we kind of now need to think seriously about that, because when I read yesterday in the Times that military leaders both in Russia and in the United States are gaming, that's their word, not mine. They think of this as a game, you know, great game or something. How will they respond to what's the likely scenario? They will be used And if they are used, what would the response look like? They don't go into any details about it, but that's part of the frame that we have to be examining right now. It seems to me that when Reagan and Gorbachev back in the 70s, when they were negotiating arms reduction treaties, they said nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Biden and Putin repeated those same words when they met in Geneva in June 2021. So we have seen that this conflict in the Ukraine and in has with Russia has gotten very contentious, and tensions are rising. Seen veiled threats are being made about the use of nuclear weapons. And we've seen that the conflict has also led to increased armament from the West, from NATO countries, and from the United States to the Ukraine. And we've seen more of a justification for increase. We've seen actual increases in military spending in our country and in Europe, and the militarization. One could argue that there's no military solution to this. I mean, we've seen this war reminds me of Vietnam in some ways, about it being a television war that we see. The Vietnam War for me came into my living room and during those years, and it was real because friends and family, brothers were of draft age, or I knew people who were going to Vietnam. And I think we've seen this war in the Ukraine documented in ways that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have not been made. So I think we have to pay close attention. And as I said, that what we need to have is peace negotiations and a ceasefire, increased role of the United States, the United Nations. I think I was heartened by the communications from Secretary General Guterres and the guarantee of the United Nations working with the Red Cross to provide humanitarian assistance. And that we're at a defining moment that we're called on to play a role in calling for peace in the region and for the elimination of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. So I thought we should have some questions, maybe.
Questions, comments? I can, let's see. Why don't I just start asking you a question? My question is that I put on the chat that the treaty that you were talking about, treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, TPNW, and then what are the attitudes of the countries that possess nuclear weapons towards this treaty, that in the fact that the 86 countries ratified this treaty?
Yeah, the nuclear weapon states have not participated, but it doesn't mean, it means it's still nuclear. Nuclear weapons are still need to be eliminated, and that it is international law. And I think that there will be, I think that there would have been more. We've been distracted, I think, and not in a bad way, because we've had to pay attention to the serious issues of the pandemic and global climate change. But I think that there's pressure on the nuclear nations. And I think that there were also discussion about the fact that the Euro missiles in Europe that had galvanized that earlier period in the 80s too, that there are nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on bases in Europe, that there were discussions going on that about that sharing U.S. being under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So many of those countries in Europe, there's a long road ahead for us to get more countries to sign on. And in June, there will be, the pandemic has prevented a lot of things, a lot of even gatherings, international gatherings, or even negotiations, I think, around Ukraine. So there has, but I think that there's going to be pressure on the, and it has to also come from pressure from the public on their governments, from the nuclear nation. The cost of these weapons, when you think about, the trade-offs, just in a U.S. budget that we're spending over $50 billion for new nuclear weapons in this budget, in the 2022 budget, and we've spent $7 billion on global vaccines for a pandemic. There are these trade-offs, and one has to be raising serious questions about where the money is going. If you make the argument that nuclear war can't be fought and it can't be won, then what is the utility of these nuclear weapons? And especially when the danger arises, as it has now, with a global nuclear power confrontation, that raises the stakes for those countries. But I think that for us regular folks, I think that the fact that the world is spending so much on nuclear weapons and on military spending, and not on the things that people really need. We're not spending on, and that's why there's been calls just recently this week by the Nobel Peace Laureates or Nobel laureates calling for a 2% cut in global spending. The world has spent $2 trillion on our military budgets. And the U.S. is the highest. We're number one in terms of $778 billion. We represent 38%. China comes next with $252 billion. India at $72 billion. Russia at $61 billion. UK at $59.2 billion. So when we look at one of the things I'd like to say is that if you look at outcomes, where you spend your money and where you make your investments, how you train people, how you educate people, that's the outcome that you get. And I argue that we need to make a shift where we're teaching peace, we're educating peace, we're asking what peace is, and that we start dealing with the human security issues that we face in terms of the climate change and future pandemics as well. That we've done it in the past. We've made progress on the environmental movements, the awareness that comes and the mobilization, and effectively, eventually, coming to government policies. I think that's the role citizens need to play.
Questions, comments? Susan, Ryan?
Hi. Thank you, Margaret. You know what my question is that, you explain the history of the treaties, and I mean, we all know nuclear, that you don't want to go there, but what are the options for the people that have signed these treaties and you have somebody like Putin that just goes into Ukraine and, is bombing it to pieces and destabilizing the world, especially Europe, with all of the people that have to leave so that they can stay alive. So my point is, how do groups like you or some of the students, how do we counteract and deal with somebody like a Putin who has, the power to do this? I mean, he's lawless and everybody else is following treaties, but where he's still doing what he's doing, which is really destabilizing the world. So I don't know. I know that's a hard question.
Well, let me take some more questions and then I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah, only because I've talked so much, I'd like to hear other voices. So let me.
Okay.
Sarah? That's
yes, hi. I'm a student in Professor Terazawa's class, and my question is similar to Ms. Ryan's question about how do you stop someone that has all like these nuclear weapons, and like obviously it's against the law, but at the same time, those laws are only just words written on a piece of paper. And now that like we're getting closer to like more war, those laws are going to start becoming like more meaningless in terms of like what we do. So how would you stop someone that has like nuclear weapons in use or will be used?
Well, anybody else want to weigh in before I say anything?
Brendan?
Oh, I also have a question, but it's not really related to this topic specifically. I don't know if you still want me to ask her, if you want to talk first.
Let me just give a short response to that. One of the needs that we need is a new global framework where what the actions of Russia and Putin are being scrutinized. They're being investigated by the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. And so I think there are consequences. I think that the sanctions and we're not getting the full story in terms of we know how there's been thousands of deaths in the Ukraine, thousands of and supposedly thousands of soldiers. So there's a high cost for the people of both the Ukraine and Russia. And I think it's one of the problems, I think, in terms of global power and the major powers having been able to do things for a long time and not be held to account. I mean, we don't have an international system, I think, that holds them sufficiently to account. I mean, even if there's I'm not one to criticize the International Criminal Court, but most of the focus has been on other countries, developing countries, rather than the countries in the global power countries, major powers that have also violated international law. The intervention in Iraq or Afghanistan or in other places, the ongoing war in Syria and in Yemen, all call into question the need for a stronger framework and consequences and isolation. I mean, we know how we change things with as we did with South Africa in terms of they become pariah nations and there's isolation and all of that. And I think we're already moving in some of those directions towards Russia. But I think, again, I caution us to think about where we come in to the movie and have an understanding of the history that has brought us to this moment. And the fact that our planners, we're still building these weapons, that our planners are still thinking about how they can be used. And it's about how we think the world should operate and how do we abide by law and make some of those things. One of the strengths, I think, of treaties is that they're supposed to be fair and universal and substantive. And that part of the history of treaties is that when there's loopholes or when there's people cheat, there are consequences and there's renegotiations and all of that. I think at the moment, I read somewhere recently that we're not very well served by our world leaders in many ways, those who are running government. And so I think that, again, puts the burden back on citizens making demands on their governments. The Russians to demand that as we did here in the United States, demand that the wars we were involved in should end, and Russians should be doing that at risk. I mean, they're taking risks doing that, and also listen to the voices of those in the Ukraine that also want this war to end, and the cost with the refugees and the humanitarian crisis that's occurring.
Can I give my opinion?
Yeah.
So I was talking to my Japanese friends about what Putin has been doing. I mean, it's the leaders of all the powerful countries that they, we think that they can do whatever they want, they want to do. But on the other hand, the superpowers like the United States, like China, like Russia, or like other major nations that I mean, you were talking about China, for example, that it, they have the economic power, they have the military power, but sometimes that's not enough for a powerful country to have some sort of like high status in the international arena. That for that the countries like big countries tend to want to have prestige. And then for that, and then that is actually could, using that, we can could possibly control the behaviors of the large nations. We don't know about, I don't know about the smaller countries like North Korea that has, nothing to lose. Even, they behaved in erratic way, but the large nations that I mean, we thought that the China now has economic power and then political and then military power, but China would also want to have some prestige, and then some like people like some leaders want to get something like a Nobel Peace Prize. So anyway, I mean, I'm just responding to Sirup's question that could you mean, for example, that you were even like with Japanese friends, we were talking that if like the world is willing to give Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, the Chinese leader would be willing to mediate this, like help mediate this, Ukraine, Russia crisis. So I mean, so I think the big countries, in order to obtain a certain status in the international arena, they don't want to. I mean, usually they don't want to do things that that the world sees hugely problematic. So anyway, what so what I've been shocked was that this is something that Putin is doing, which I didn't think that he would do. Anyway, it's my little comment.
Brendan, you had a question too?
So my question was basically, because I know you had mentioned very briefly, like other use for nuclear power. Do you think that in terms of both disarmament of nuclear weapons and also just the use of things like uranium and plutonium, would you say that the cat is like far too out of the bag to ever fully contain like the use of weapons? Because on one hand, the use of like nuclear missiles and stuff is like this horrifying thing, mutually assured destruction. But on the other hand, there are groups that are pushing for things like nuclear power and like the use of these sorts of chemicals, the same kinds you would use in a weapon to create like sorts of power. My mind kind of goes to like the Iraq crisis in 2003 and stuff like that, the US invasion, based on whether or not there was an actual weapons program or if it was just use of power. So I guess it basically comes down to, is there a way to reconcile with the fact that we have discovered these technologies? And is there any sort of path forward to figuring out a way to contain both sides of the issue?
I would argue that we don't have a choice. When you think about how much the world has changed, like just the way we communicate, the communications and social media and the cell phones, things, look, we were riding horses and then automobiles and then airplanes. And so what can be imagined is possible. And the crisis we face, part of all of this and the lever that the Russians have over Europe is about gas and oil, right? the whole issue of fossil fuels, which has fueled wars, wars for oil and or resources, other resources now that are essential to, all of that is taking place. But in order to deal with having a sustainable world, one where we can live and we're not destroying ourselves, because even if we didn't have the nuclear weapons and the possible use of them now in Ukraine, we're facing those existential threats of global climate change that require the less reliance on fossil fuels. And we have technologies that are moving in that direction in terms of, solar and wind and cells and thermal and all of that. So that there are already plans or steps to move in that direction, but underinvested. And these are things we've known for a really long time. When you think about the environmental movement in the 70s, galvanizing people to think about we shouldn't be burning coal in New York City because it's polluting the air and people can't breathe. And we need clean water and clean air, and we can't be putting pesticides in the land because then we can't farm. And when we look at those issues now and the consequences of, nuclear weapons production or nuclear power plants and waste and its effect on water and the environment, we've known this for a long time. So that there have been proposals and plans, but it requires investment. And that's where I come back to where is the money going to solve that particular problem. And I think in terms of nuclear weapons, the moment that those bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of those there at that moment, and some of the scientists who were involved in that, the development of nuclear weapons, thinking the Germans were going to get it, and we had to have it first, and a lot of what we didn't know in terms of the effects, that its ability to destroy a city and wipe out 100,000 people in an instant, and then the legacy of all of that. People had health problems and other kinds of things from those atomic bombs, but also in terms of just the production. We haven't reconciled ourselves with the history of the nuclear age in some ways. But I think that the groups that have been step by step, in my following of this up to this treaty, to prohibit nuclear weapons, that people have been methodically, lawyers and other groups and experts, physicists, have moved in the direction of how we dismantle these, and we come to international agreements that ban their production and their use. And I think that's the human potential. That we can imagine a world like that, and then we need to be working towards it. And part of it, I must say, comes back to the money. That if we want to go in a certain direction, if you want to go to college, you have to pay. We have to pay for it, or the society has to pay for it. An educated community. If we want to save the environment, we have to invest in those technologies, and we have to deal with the effects of climate change and how it has increased migration and all of that. So there's a lot to do. Kurt Vonnegut has a wonderful book called Timequake, and it's like you go to sleep for a minute and then you wake up, somebody wakes you up and says, hurry up, there's work to do, and there's work for us to do. And it's a heavy load in some ways, but to me, the power of citizens' movements on so many issues, gun control, on nuclear weapons, on the environment and climate change, recognizes the possibilities that human beings have to solve these problems and to create a world where we can live together.
Great, thank you.
Brandon, you had your hand up too?
I advertise this talk, for like women's studies people. So in Japan, one of the groups that strongly opposed the expansion of this, just like escalating of arms race and accumulating nuclear weapons was a mothers group. So, and it's not a women's group and a mothers group. So there was some conservative element in this movement, but I would like to ask you to talk about the women's contribution to this anti-nuclear disarmament movement in the United States or worldwide.
I mentioned Randy Forsberg before, one of the leaders of the nuclear freeze movement, and how concrete she made it, and how she gave us the tools to be able to be more knowledgeable and more active. But in the work also in the nuclear disarmament movement, that we could also point out Helen Caldecott from Physicians for Social Responsibility. There are so many women, Cora Weiss with the Women's Strike for Peace, that were working really hard that resulted in the test ban treaties. Moray Maguire from Ireland in the peace agreements, and connecting the issues of militarism and peace and the well-being of children and mothers. So I'm just mentioning a few women. I'm not going to mention too many more because I'm going to get in trouble, I suppose, if I leave somebody out. But there, Beatrice Finn with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. One of the amazing things during the cruise missile deployment was the women in England, in Greenham Commons, because of the deployment, they surrounded the base with 50,000 people, and they set up a camp. It raised consciousness. I mean, part of in a talk that yesterday, we were talking about some of these issues in terms of connecting peace and global climate change. And it's like, you need to be visible, you need to be loud. And the women, like the first woman that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, Jane Addams, she connected the concerns of women, the needs of children, and world peace. Because it's as basic as that, like if we want peace, we need to really make it concrete. Like it's not just some fuzzy, like we're all happy and it's sunflowers and sunshine and rainbows, but it's very concrete in terms of, it means people, like the Declaration of Human Rights says, it means that people have housing, people have jobs, people have education, people have equality, people have the right to vote, people have a right to live in safety and in security. And that means, to come back to our earlier comments about the big countries having more of a power, like we already, and they do. Look, we look at the Security Council, the major countries have veto power about things. But there is the General Assembly that passes resolutions and that moves the treaty process forward. And once things become international law, they become like normalization of law that is mostly abided by. I mean, and if the country isn't going, and it's hard to kind of pigeonhole, I think, the great powers. But I think that those treaties, like the United States has not signed on to the International Criminal Court or the law of the sea, but most countries follow it, and we abide by it as well, so that there's enormous pressure that becomes the norm. And so there's work to do on it, and engaging. We'll see what happens when the conference comes up for review with the state parties up in June too. So pay attention to that. Anything else, Yuki?
I have like more questions. The one thing that has been like hotly discussed is the invention of small nuclear weapons, which like small nuclear missile, and then I was just like reading the Japanese news that this was made in France, so and then these there are some military strategists who are saying that these smaller nuclear weapons can be used very strategically, like without causing like huge damage to the environment, and then it could it is so Japanese right-wing conservatives are are really wanting to have this, and then so this makes me very worried about the further spread of nuclear weapons because of the invention of smaller nuclear missiles. And then I want to talk about it. I mean, if you have any comments on this.
I think that in the present conversation, the concern is that the escalation from the use of tactical weapons and a confrontation that is larger than that, that involves the NATO, that then it's not just an invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, that it becomes a confrontation between Europe and the NATO countries and the United States against Russia, that raises the stakes. I mean, I think one of the concerns always has been about things getting out of control. And not being able to, it's like the atom bomb. Once the genie is there, and how do we control it? Is a key question in all of this.
Comments, questions? I have more questions. Actually, I saw this Japanese this was a documentary film made by Japanese TV company, but this was about people, like American people who basically got cancer because of the testing of nuclear bomb in 1945, and then maybe like not only in 1945, but maybe the government, like the weapon making companies, like kept doing testing in New Mexico. I'm not really like knowledgeable about this, but there were like many people who lived they were talking about to which direction that the wind blow, and then some people inhaled a lot of radioactive materials, and then they got cancer, and then they've been fighting like many years to get compensation from the American government, but that they were unsuccessful because it was very difficult for them to prove that they got cancer because of these testings. So I just would like, very curious about what has been going on. I never knew that all I knew was that the victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I just didn't know that there were those American people who became victims of radiation poisoning because of all the testings.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's a story that that downwinders and people who were they had soldiers going in during the testing before the atomic bombs were dropped that were affected by the test in Nevada and New Mexico, and the atmospheric test and the wind that would blow on communities affected people with cancers, killed animals. It took a lot of organizing and again citizens holding. Trying to hold our government to account that because this was like, no, this isn't happening, so it had to be documented and studied, and lawyers got involved in order for compensation. And the other part was just the uranium miners and the indigenous peoples in those areas. French testing in the Pacific Islands. I mean, there's a lot to hold our government to account. And it took a long time to unravel the actual damages that were done because of the testing and the production. Like when you look at nuclear weapon sites around the country for the production of plutonium or for other components of the nuclear weapons, that it's polluted the water. You know, their legacy in military bases that have left, you know, toxic things that have polluted the water and the land, made it so that it's and affected people's health in those regions. So there's a lot of studies and a lot of reports on all of this.
I mean, what I was struck by watching this Japanese documentary video is the level of secrecy that people bought this land and then built a house, and then they never knew that there was this huge amount of nuclear waste, like, you know, like existed in the backyard, and that sort of a story. So it's just like, I was just stunned by the fact that information was not made public.
Well, I think that people knew, and whether the larger public knows or how much gets reported, and what gets reported and where, how important it is for us to kind of look at these issues about what's going on in Ukraine, or what's going on in terms of the need to eliminate nuclear weapons and why. Because they're killing us one way or another. They're killing us when they're being produced. They're killing us if they're dropped on us, and they're killing us if it means that we're spending money on $50 billion a year or more on nuclear weapons and not spending money on healthcare or on dealing with the pandemic or dealing with global climate change. That these are, it's hard to say that they're just trade-offs in that economic term, you know, like we choose one or we choose B or something like that. It really is choosing between whether we live or not, if we don't deal with these issues of nuclear weapons and global climate change. And I want to really just emphasize that there are people all over the world that are, you know, calling for this mobilization to end the war. May 7th, the world is going to have another global action calling for an end to the war in Ukraine, and that the world leaders do have to step up. China has to come in and play a positive role as well, as and because Russia has to be isolated, I think, at this moment, but then has to be brought in. We can't even solve these problems unless China and Russia and the United States and other countries sign on to this, you know, and the rest of the world that aren't the great powers, and I don't want to call them great powers, they're powerful countries, I think. They were superpowers, and maybe there's, you know, there's a shifting in dominance and who gets to call the shots and all of that. But the problems we're facing can't be resolved unless the countries work together and cooperate. That's what, you know, so that's why this is a defining moment in so many ways. That the question that was asked, like, can we imagine that that is possible to have the, you know, nuclear weapons ended or to deal with climate change? I think we can imagine it because we have blueprints, plans, and ideas, and they have to, and that will move us forward. But I think the fact that there's an awareness around the world about having to end this war and prevent the use of nuclear weapons so that it doesn't escalate into a great power or a superpower confrontation, that there's a recognition here in the States about linking, as Martin Luther King did, the racism and militarism and poverty with the Poor People's Campaign that's reaching, you know, thousands of people. We have a Long Island Poor People's Campaign, New York State, around the country, mobilizing to press for an end to racism and violence, and a call for funding human needs at home and abroad. So those efforts, global and local and national, will have an impact, and it's up to us to become involved. We have to care about some of this, even if it's for our own Okay, I froze.
Margaret, we didn't hear the last part of your.
I'm sorry, I froze for some reason. I just think that we need to be able to, as individuals, and know that somewhere along there we care about some part of this, whether and survive and to be safe and to survive. So I think we need to be paying attention. We need to be you all are taking history courses, so you're looking at this in a context, not just in this little moment. I tried to sketch that out in my own little life story, but I think that how we're affected by different events in history, and it shapes our worldview. But we have to be bringing in other points of view and be able to hear. And we're in such a divisive moment in this country that we need to be able to hear what other people have to say, and how are we going to work together to make this a planet, a safer planet, and and deal with global climate change and conflict and weapons. And again, what if we want to pursue peace? We have to become what we want to. Gandhi told us, if you want peace, you have to become peace, or something like that. But I think we need to look at that, push our government. Organizations like Peace Action or Code Pink or others, meeting with representatives, bringing citizens' voices to the table, gathering with our friends and neighbors and talking about these things. It seems so much in this moment is difficult, because we're living in, our whole lives have been, as I'm sure for the Ukrainian people, their lives have been destroyed. For us, dealing with pandemics and COVID, our lives have been turned upside down. We've had to adapt to new ways of having Zoom and in school and in meetings and things like that. But and dealing with the issues that seem beyond us, and governments that seem to be not working for people in ways that they should be. We have to hold our governments and our public officials to account, just as we want to hold leaders around the world to account for their behavior in terms of humanitarian human rights violations, and for war, and for causing war and conflict, and for repression. We have the possibility in this country to be able to take a lead on some of these issues, and I think that's where the money should be going.
Okay, so maybe it's time to end this talk. Some of my students, if you have like 15 minutes, could you stay on because Hofstra Clinical, the reporter from Hofstra Clinical wants to interview some students about this talk. So if some of my students could stay, that would be great. But I would like to end the formal part of the talk, and we would like to give Ms. Melkonian like a big hand.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.